Colonel Faustino smashed his brother's silver pocket watch and threw the jagged pieces at the old stableman as a cruel joke. He wanted to see the old man crawl in the dust for a piece of junk. But what the colonel didn't know was that he had just handed over the only evidence that could put a noose around his own neck. The gears were dead, but the secret hidden behind the rusted spring was about to start moving. The sun over Fazenda Tres Correntes didn't just shine. It burned. It was a heavy, suffocating heat that smelled of scorched earth and the bitter sweat of men who had no hope left. This land used to be different. When Otavio was the master, there was a sense of order, a quiet dignity even in the hard work of the cane fields. But Otavio was gone now. He had died in his bed gasping for air while his younger brother, Faustino, watched from the shadows of the room. Now, the plantation belonged to a man who loved the dice more than the land. Faustino stood on the porch of the big house, his boots polished to a mirror shine that the red dust of the road couldn't wait to ruin. He was a man built of sharp angles and a short temper. His eyes were always bloodshot, a mix of too much cane spirit and the constant pressure of debts he couldn't pay. He looked out over the stables and saw Bento. Bento was 60 years old, with hands that looked like gnarled tree roots. But those hands were steady. They were the only hands on the entire plantation that could calm a panicked horse or fix a broken plow with nothing but a bit of wire and patience. The colonel hated Bento. He hated him because Bento had been loyal to Otavio. He hated him because Bento knew what the plantation looked like when a real man was in charge. Faustino reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the silver watch. It was a beautiful piece, or it had been. It was a gift from their father to Otavio, the eldest. It was a symbol of inheritance, of the right to lead. Faustino looked at the polished silver case and felt a surge of pure, unadulterated spite. He didn't want the watch. He wanted the power, but he hated the reminder that he had stolen it. With a sudden, violent motion, he slammed the watch against the stone railing of the porch. The glass shattered, the delicate silver casing dented. He did it again, harder this time, until the internal gears spilled out like the guts of a small animal. Then he laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound. He saw Bento walking toward the stables and called out to him. His voice was like a whip cracking in the still air. "Hey, old man, come here." Bento stopped. He didn't look up immediately. He took a breath, letting the dust settle in his lungs, and then turned. He walked with a limp, a souvenir from a horse that had kicked him 20 years ago, but he moved with a quiet strength. He approached the porch, keeping his eyes on the colonel's boots. He knew better than to look a man like Faustino in the eye when the colonel was in one of his moods. "You like fixing things, don't you, Bento?" Faustino sneered, dangling the mangled silver remains by the chain. "My brother always said you were a genius with your hands. Said you could make a dead engine breathe again." Bento didn't answer. He waited. "Well, here's a challenge for you," Faustino said, and with a flick of his wrist he tossed the broken watch into the dirt at Bento's feet. "It's trash now. Just like my brother. If you can make it tick by the time the moon is full, maybe I won't have you whipped for being so slow in the stables. If not, consider it a reminder of what happens to things that don't work anymore on my land." Bento looked down at the silver in the dirt. He didn't say a word. He knelt, his old knees popping, and carefully gathered the pieces. He picked up the tiny brass gears, the broken hands, and the dented case. He felt the weight of it in his palm. It was cold. It was dead. But as his thumb brushed against the back of the casing, he felt something strange, a slight misalignment, a gap that shouldn't have been there. "Look at this. Some people call this tradition, but it's just cruelty with a name and a surname." Bento tucked the remains of the watch into his pocket and walked back to the stables. He didn't look back at the colonel, who was already calling for more drink. The stables were his sanctuary. The smell of old leather, hay, and horses was better than the smell of the big house, which always reeked of expensive cigars and the rot of Faustino's soul. He went to his small workbench in the corner, under a single flickering lantern. He laid the pieces out. It was a mess. Faustino had done a thorough job. The mainspring was snapped, and several of the pivot holes were elongated from the impact. To anyone else, it was scrap metal. But Bento saw more than the damage. He saw the craftsmanship, Ottavio had cherished this watch. He used to sit on the porch in the evenings, checking the time against the setting sun, a peaceful smile on his face. Why would a man like Ottavio be so attached to a machine? The questions started to itch in Bento's mind. He began to clean the dirt from the pieces using a fine brush made of horsehair. He worked in silence, the only sound being the soft breathing of the horses in their stalls. Outside, the plantation was settling into the uneasy silence of the night. The workers were in their huts, exhausted, whispering about the colonel's latest outburst. They all knew the plantation was dying. The crops were failing because Faustino refused to invest in new seed, and the debts were piling up. There were rumors that the colonel had lost 300 head of cattle in a single card game in the village of Salto Escuro. As Bento cleaned the silver backplate of the watch, his fingers traced a hidden seam. It was incredibly fine, almost invisible to the naked eye. It wasn't part of the watch's movement. It was something else, a double bottom. His heart began to thud against his ribs. He took a small, thin blade he used for leather work and carefully inserted it into the seam. He didn't pry. He felt for a release. Click. The sound was tiny, no louder than a dry twig snapping, but in the silence of the stable, it sounded like a gunshot. The back of the watch case didn't just open, it slid to the side, revealing a hollow space no thicker than a coin, and inside that space, tightly folded, was a piece of parchment. It was thin, almost translucent, and it was covered in fine, elegant handwriting. Bento's hands shook. He knew that handwriting. It was Ottavio's. He carefully unfolded the paper, his eyes darting toward the stable door to make sure no one was watching. The lantern light was dim, but the words jumped out at him. It wasn't a poem. It wasn't a letter of affection. It was a legal declaration, witnessed and sealed by the local priest of Salto Escuro, just 3 days before Ottavio fell ill. The document stated clearly that the debt notes held by Faustino were forgeries. It stated that Ottavio had never gambled away the land. But more importantly, it spoke of a bitter taste in the evening tea, and a brother who couldn't wait for nature to take its course. It was a death warrant written by a man who knew he was being murdered. Bento felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He realized then that Faustino hadn't just thrown away a watch, he had thrown away the evidence of his fratricide. The colonel was arrogant. He thought he had searched everything. He thought his brother was a simple man who kept his secrets in drawers and safes. He never imagined that the most important document in the history of Tres Correntes was ticking in his brother's pocket the whole time. But now the secret was in Bento's hands. And Bento was a man who knew exactly how dangerous the truth could be. If Faustino realized what he had done, if he remembered that his brother used to fiddle with that watch in a way that suggested a secret, he would burn the stables to the ground with Bento inside it, just to get that paper back. Bento looked at the stallion in the end stall, a massive, charcoal-colored beast named Midnight. No one could ride him. No one could even get close to him without getting bitten or kicked, except for Bento. The horse watched him with intelligent, wary eyes. Bento looked back at the watch, then at the paper. He couldn't keep it in his pocket. He couldn't hide it in his hut. The colonel's men searched the huts whenever they felt like it, just to remind the workers who was in charge. He needed a place where no one would dare look. A place where the truth could wait until the time was right, because word was traveling through the muleteers that Judge Morellis was coming. The judge was a man of the law, a man from the capital who didn't care for local colonels or their blood-stained traditions. He was coming to verify the land titles in the valley. Bento looked at the watch again. The gears were broken, but the truth was finally starting to move. He just had to make sure he stayed alive long enough to hear it strike the hour. He reached for a piece of oiled cloth to wrap the parchment, his mind already racing. The hunt hadn't started yet, but he could hear the hounds in the distance. Faustino would remember. A man like that always remembers his mistakes when it's almost too late. And when he did, the Tres Correntes plantation would become a battlefield. Bento gripped the silver casing so hard his knuckles turned white. He wasn't just a stableman anymore. He was the keeper of the ghost's voice. Faustino didn't just wake up with a hangover the next morning. He woke up with a hole in his memory that was starting to fill with cold, hard fear. The sun was barely over the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor of the big house, when he remembered the sound. Not the sound of the watch smashing. No, he remembered a different sound from years ago. He remembered sitting in the library, watching his brother Ottavio through a crack in the door. Ottavio had been holding that silver watch, pressing a tiny invisible lever near the hinge. Click. That small metallic noise echoed in Faustino's mind like a gunshot. His blood ran cold. He scrambled out of bed, his silk sheets tangling around his legs like a trap. He didn't even bother with his boots. He ran to the porch, his bare feet slapping against the cold stone, looking for the spot where he had humiliated Bento the night before. But the dirt was empty. The silver shards, the brass gears, the broken hands. Everything was gone. Bento had cleaned it all up. Faustino gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. He wasn't thinking about the watch as a piece of jewelry anymore. He was thinking about it as a container. Ottavio was a man of secrets, a man who didn't trust the walls of his own house. If there was a document, a will, a confession, a letter to the authorities, that watch was exactly where he would have hidden it. And Faustino had just handed it to the one man on the plantation who had the skills to open it and the motive to use it. "Guedes!" Faustino roared, his voice cracking with desperation. Guedes, the head overseer, appeared from around the corner of the house. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of old sun-dried meat, with a whip always coiled at his hip like a sleeping snake. He didn't ask questions. He just waited for orders. "Go to the quarters," Faustino hissed, leaning over the railing. "Search every hut, every floorboard, every mattress. I'm looking for a silver watch. If anyone resists, break their bones. If you find it, bring it to me. If you don't find it, start burning the straw." Guedes nodded, a cruel smile touching his lips, and turned toward the slave quarters. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Rosa was trembling. She was barely 20, but she had seen enough horror to last 3 lifetimes. She was the one who had brought the tea to Ottavio's bedside on his final night. She was the one who had seen Faustino standing by the medicine cabinet, his shadow stretched long and thin against the wall, dropping something clear and odorless into the bottle of tincture. She had stayed silent out of terror, but the guilt was a heavy stone in her chest. She watched through the kitchen window as Guedes and 3 other men marched toward the quarters. She knew they were looking for something important. She had seen Bento earlier that morning, his face like a mask of granite, heading toward the stables with his hands deep in his pockets. She knew Bento. He was like a father to her in a world that tried to orphan everyone. In the stables, the air was thick with the scent of musk and fear. Bento could hear the shouting starting near the huts. He heard the crash of pottery and the screams of women as Guedes began his raid. He knew he didn't have much time. He looked at the silver watch on his workbench. He had managed to straighten the lever just enough to test the mechanism. The secret compartment was real, and the document inside was his only shield. But if they found it on him, he was a dead man. He looked at the stallion. Midnight. The horse was agitated, sensing the tension in the air. He was a beautiful, dangerous animal, a mass of black muscle and unpredictable rage. The colonel's men were terrified of him. Even Guedes kept his distance after Midnight had nearly crushed his ribs a month ago. Bento took a strip of soft leather. He folded the parchment into a tiny, tight square and wrapped it in the oiled cloth. Then he did something incredibly dangerous. He approached the stallion, whispering low, guttural words in a language the masters didn't understand. The horse tossed its head, baring its teeth. But Bento didn't flinch. He reached under the horse's thick, matted mane and tied the small leather pouch directly to the heavy iron ring of the horse's collar, hidden deep beneath the hair and the leather padding. It was a gamble. If the horse bolted or if someone managed to subdue him, the secret was gone. But it was the only place Guedes wouldn't dare to look. Just as Bento stepped back, the stable doors flew open. Light flooded in, blinding him for a second. Guedes stood there, his whip trailing in the dust. Behind him, the smoke from the first burning hut was already beginning to drift across the yard. "Out, old man!" Guedes growled. "The colonel wants his toy back." Bento held up his hands, palms empty. "He threw it away, Master Guedes. He said it was trash." "He changed his mind," Guedes said, stepping into the stable. His eyes flicked to the workbench. He saw the tiny brass gears and the broken glass, but the silver casing was gone. Bento had buried the empty shell in a bucket of manure 5 minutes earlier. Geddes walked over to Bento and shoved him against the wooden post. He began to strip Bento's thin shirt, searching for any hidden pockets. He found nothing but a few copper coins and a piece of string. Geddes spat on the floor, frustrated. He turned his gaze toward the stalls. "Where is the silver, Bento? I know you took it. You were always a magpie for shiny things." "I don't have it," Bento said, his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Maybe the dogs took it. Maybe it's in the dirt where he threw it." Geddes walked toward Midnight's stall. The horse let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that started deep in its chest. It lashed out at the wooden slats with a hoof, the sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. Geddes flinched, stepping back. He hated that horse. He saw it as a reflection of the rebellion he couldn't quite beat out of the workers. "If I find out you're lying," Geddes said, pointing a finger at Bento, "I won't just whip you. I'll make sure you're conscious when I give you to the dogs." He turned and stormed out, calling for his men to move to the tool shed. Bento slumped against the post, the sweat cold on his forehead. He looked at Midnight. The horse was still, its dark eyes fixed on the door. The document was safe for now, but the plantation was turning into a powder keg. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe. And tell me, was this proof, the watch, a warning, or a sentence? Back at the big house, Faustino was pacing the library. He had found his brother's ledger, but the pages for the last 6 months had been torn out. He realized now that Ottavio had been onto him long before the poisoning. Ottavio wasn't just dying, he was preparing a trap. The problem was that the district judge, Mireles, wasn't just coming for a social visit. He was coming because a letter had reached the capital, a letter that suggested the land titles for Tres Correntes were under dispute. Faustino had assumed it was one of his creditors, but now he realized it might have been Ottavio himself, reaching out from the grave. If that silver watch held the proof of the forgery, and if that proof reached Mireles, Faustino wouldn't just lose the plantation, he would lose his life. The law for fratricide was clear, and Mireles was a man who enjoyed the weight of the gavel. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was Rosa. She was holding a tray with a fresh pot of coffee, her hands shaking so much the china rattled. "Set it down and get out," Faustino snapped, not looking at her. But Rosa didn't move. She stood there, her eyes fixed on the empty medicine cabinet in the corner. She remembered the bottle. She remembered the smell of bitter almonds that had filled Ottavio's room. "Master," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What?" Faustino turned, his eyes narrowing. "The old master. He didn't die of the fever, did he?" The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Faustino stopped pacing. He walked toward her, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He stopped just inches from her face, the smell of stale rum and tobacco washing over her. "What did you say?" Rosa realized she had said too much. The fear that had been simmering in her for months had finally boiled over, but it was a mistake, a fatal one. I just meant—" "He was so strong," she stammered, backing away. Faustino grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into her skin like claws. "You saw something, didn't you? You've been sitting in that kitchen, whispering with the others, thinking you know something about my business." "No, master, I saw nothing." "You're a liar," Faustino hissed, "and I don't keep liars in my house." He shoved her toward the door. "Geddes, take this girl to the shed. She needs to be taught the value of a silent tongue." As Rosa was dragged away, screaming, Bento watched from the stable window. He saw her being pulled toward the whipping post, and he knew the clock was ticking faster than he could have ever imagined. The colonel was unraveling. The more he tried to cover his tracks, the more blood he spilled. Bento looked at Midnight. He knew he couldn't wait for the judge to arrive at the plantation. He had to go to the judge. But the road to Salto Escuro was guarded, and a man like Bento wouldn't get a mile before being caught. He needed a distraction. He needed a way to turn the colonel's own paranoia against him. He looked at the broken gears on his workbench. He had an idea. It was a desperate move, one that would likely cost him his life, but if it worked, It would tear the mask off Faustino's face in front of the whole world. He began to gather the brass scraps, his hands moving with a purpose they hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just fixing a watch anymore. He was building a trap. The air at Fazenda Tres Correntes was no longer just hot. It was thick with the smell of wet ashes and old blood. Geddes didn't wait for the sun to hit its peak before he dragged Rosa to the center of the yard. He tied her wrists to the heavy wooden post with a practiced, indifferent flick of the rope. The girl wasn't screaming anymore. She was just shivering, her eyes wide and fixed on the big house, hoping for a mercy that wasn't coming. Colonel Faustino stood on the porch, a glass of dark rum in his hand. He wasn't looking at the girl. He was looking at the horizon, toward the road that led to Salto Escuro. He knew the judge was coming. He could feel the weight of the law moving toward him like a slow-moving storm. Every minute that Silver Watch remained missing was a minute closer to his own execution. He turned his gaze to Bento, who was standing by the stable door, his face as still as a tombstone. "Start," Faustino said. The word was small, but it carried across the yard like a death sentence. Geddes raised the whip. The leather hissed as it cut through the air. But before the first strike could land, a sound stopped everyone in their tracks. It was a rhythmic, metallic clinking. Bento had stepped into the yard. He wasn't running and he wasn't begging. He was holding something in his hand, shaking it. It was a collection of brass gears and silver scraps, tied together with a bit of twine. "You want the watch, Colonel?" Bento asked. His voice was raspy, but it didn't tremble. "You want the thing that's making you so afraid?" Faustino's eyes bulged. He almost dropped his glass. "Bring it here, old man. Now." "I'll bring it," Bento said, "but only if you let the girl go. She doesn't know anything. She never saw what you did to your brother. She's just a child." That was a mistake. Mentioning Ottavio's death out loud was like throwing a torch into a warehouse of gunpowder. Faustino's face went from pale to a deep bruised purple. He realized then that it wasn't just a rumor. The stableman knew. The kitchen maid knew. The whole plantation was a nest of witnesses, and he was the only one who didn't have the truth in his pocket. "Geddes," Faustino whispered, his voice shaking with rage. "Forget the girl. Get the watch from him. Use the iron if you have to." But Bento was faster than he looked. As Geddes lunged forward, Bento didn't run toward the fields. He ran back into the stables. He knew the geography of that dark, hay-scented space better than he knew the lines on his own palms. He dove behind a stack of grain sacks, just as Geddes burst through the doors, the whip already cracking against the wooden stalls. The problem was that Bento was 60 years old and trapped. He had the decoy in his hand, a collection of worthless scraps he'd put together to buy time. The real document, the one that could actually end this nightmare, was still hidden under the mane of the stallion at the back of the stable. Midnight was sensing the violence. He was kicking at the walls of his stall, his hooves sounding like thunder in the confined space. "I can hear you breathing, Bento," Geddes shouted, his boots heavy on the dirt floor. "You think you're smart? You think you can play games with the Colonel? I'll peel the skin off your back and make a new watch strap out of it." Inside the dark stall, Bento felt a wave of pure, cold exhaustion. He looked at his hands. They were shaking now. He thought about Ottavio, the man who had treated him like a human being in a place designed to break them. He thought about the letter hidden on the horse. If he died here, the letter died with him. The Colonel would find it eventually, or it would rot away, and the truth would be buried forever. He couldn't let that happen. Suddenly a low whistle echoed from the back of the stable, near the rear loading door. It was Tiao, the muleteer. He was supposed to be on the road, but he had doubled back. He was peering through a gap in the wood, his eyes wide with fear. "Bento," Tiao whispered. "The judge. He's not coming to the house. He stopped at the village. He's taking his dinner at the square. If you're going to move, it has to be now." The plan changed in a heartbeat. Bento realized he couldn't wait for the judge to come to him. He had to take the evidence to the judge in public, where Faustino couldn't just bury the truth in a shallow grave. But to do that, he had to get past Geddes, and he had to get Midnight out of the stable. "Geddes!" Bento yelled from behind the grain sacks. "You want it? Here, catch!" He threw the bundle of brass and twine over the sacks, sending it flying toward the front of the stable. Geddes, driven by greed and the fear of his master, dove for it, thinking he had finally secured the prize. In that split second of distraction, Bento scrambled toward Midnight's stall. He didn't use a saddle. He didn't use a bridle. He just grabbed the stallion's mane and whispered a single word in the horse's ear. It was a word of command, a word of release. Midnight didn't hesitate. He reared up, his massive chest slamming into the stall door, bursting the latch like it was made of dry twigs. Geddes looked up just in time to see 500 pounds of black muscle charging toward him. He screamed, throwing himself out of the way as the stallion thundered past, his hooves narrowly missing Geddes' skull. Bento was clinging to the horse's neck, his fingers dug deep into the coarse hair, right next to the hidden leather pouch. They burst out of the stable and into the blinding sunlight of the yard. Faustino, still on the porch, saw the black streak of the horse and the old man. He saw his world escaping. "Get the horses!" Faustino screamed, pointing toward the road. "Don't let him reach the village. Shoot the horse, shoot the man, I don't care, just bring me that watch." The chase was on. But what Faustino didn't realize was that Midnight wasn't a carriage horse. He was a creature of the wild, and he was running for more than just his life. He was carrying the weight of a decade of lies. As they hit the main road, the dust rising in a thick cloud behind them, Bento could hear the sounds of the colonel's men mounting up. He could hear the dogs being released. The road to Salto Escuro was long, and it was lined with thick brush where a man could be ambushed a dozen times over. But Bento wasn't looking back. He was looking at the collar of the horse. The small leather pouch was still there. The dead gears of the watch were gone, but the heart of the truth was beating faster than ever. Behind him, the first gunshot rang out. The lead ball whistled past his ear, thudding into a tree trunk to his left. Faustino wasn't playing games anymore. He was willing to turn the road into a graveyard to keep his secret. And then, the first micro-loop began to tighten. Why was the colonel so sure he could catch them? He knew something about the road that Bento didn't. He knew about the bridge at Ribeirão das Almas. "Faster, boy," Bento urged, his voice lost in the wind. "If we don't cross the water before they close the gap, we're both dead." The plantation was fading into the distance, but the shadow of the colonel was stretching out, trying to pull them back into the dark. Bento gripped the horse tighter, his mind focused on one thing: the face of the judge. He had to make it. He had to show the world that even a broken watch can tell the right time when justice finally arrives. The bridge at Ribeirão das Almas was a narrow, rotting spine of timber that groaned under the weight of even a single man. Below it, the river was a churning soup of red mud and jagged rocks, swollen by the recent rains in the mountains. Bento could hear the water roaring, a sound that tried to drown out the thunder of the hooves behind him. He didn't need to look back to know that Geddes and the others were closing in. The dust cloud on the horizon was thick, and the sound of the dogs was getting sharper, more hungry. Midnight's breath was coming in ragged, wet heaves now. The stallion was a marvel of nature, but he wasn't made of iron. His coat was lathered in white foam, and his ears were pinned back against his skull. Bento leaned forward, pressing his chest against the horse's neck, feeling the frantic vibration of the animal's heart. He reached under the mane, his fingers brushing the small leather pouch tied to the collar. It was still there. The truth was still riding with him. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe. And tell me, this watch, this broken piece of silver, was it a warning or a sentence for a man like Faustino? But as the bridge came into view, Bento's blood turned to ice. He wasn't the only one who knew about the shortcut through the valley. Standing at the far end of the bridge, silhouetted against the dying sun, was a lone rider. It was Faustino. He hadn't stayed at the house to wait for news. His desperation had given him wings. He stood there, his horse blocked the way, and in his hand he held a long-barreled pistol. "Stop right there, you old thief!" Faustino's voice carried over the roar of the water. He wasn't the arrogant master anymore. He looked unhinged. His hair was wild and his clothes were torn from the brush. "You give me that watch or I'll blow you and that beast straight into the Ribeirão." Bento pulled back on the mane, bringing Midnight to a skidding halt just yards from the edge of the bridge. The horse reared, its hooves pawing at the air, sensing the killer in front of them. Behind Bento, the rest of the men were catching up. He was trapped between the river, the whip, and the bullet. "It's over, Colonel," Bento shouted, his voice cracking but firm. "The judge is in the village. He's already asking questions. Do you think killing me here is going to stop what's coming? You can't shoot a ghost, and Ottavio is standing right next to you." Faustino's hand shook. The mention of his brother's name was like a physical blow. He looked around frantically, as if expecting to see a dead man emerging from the trees. This was the crack in the armor. Faustino wasn't just afraid of the law, he was terrified of the blood on his hands. He had killed more than just his brother to get this land. There was the lawyer in the capital who had suddenly disappeared after questioning the debt notes. There was the stable boy before Bento, who had seen too much and was found floating in this very river. The colonel's path to the big house was paved with bones. "Shut up!" Faustino screamed. "I am the law here. I am the master of Tres Correntes." "You're a murderer," Bento said, his voice dropping to a low, cold whisper. "And you're a fool. You threw away the very thing that proved who you really are." At that moment, Gades and the other riders burst from the tree line behind Bento. They surrounded him, their horses circling like sharks. Gades had a fresh coil of rope in his hand, and his face was twisted in a mask of pure malice. He looked at the colonel, waiting for the order to strike. But Faustino wasn't looking at Gades. He was looking at Bento's hand, which was now reaching for the horse's collar. "The paper," Faustino whispered, the realization finally hitting him. "It's not in the watch. It's on the horse." He leveled the pistol at Bento's chest. The hammer clicked back. It was a small sound, but it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Bento looked into the black hole of the barrel and didn't blink. He knew that if he died here, the truth would die with him. But he also knew something about Faustino. The colonel was a gambler, and a gambler always hesitates when he's not sure what's in his opponent's hand. "If you shoot," Bento said, "the horse will bolt into the river. The paper will be lost in the mud forever. You'll never be sure if someone else has a copy. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for the next ghost to show up." Faustino's finger tensed on the trigger. He was weighing the odds. He could kill the man, but he needed the proof destroyed. He needed to hold that parchment in his hands and watch it burn. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension. It was the high, clear note of a brass horn. A carriage was approaching from the direction of the village. It wasn't just any carriage. It was painted a deep, somber black with the seal of the Ministry of Justice on the door. Judge Mireles had decided not to wait for dinner. He was moving toward the plantation, and he was doing it with an escort of 4 armed soldiers on horseback. The timing was like a divine intervention, or perhaps just the inevitable result of a truth that refused to stay buried. Faustino's face went white. He looked at the approaching carriage, then back at Bento. He had seconds to decide. If he killed Bento now, the soldiers would see it. If he let him go, the truth would reach the judge. "Gades, get him!" Faustino barked, lowering his pistol. He couldn't bring himself to fire with the law watching. "Take the horse now!" Gades lunged, but Bento didn't wait. He didn't try to fight. He dug his heels into Midnight's flanks and steered the horse toward the side of the bridge. Not onto the rotting wood, but toward the steep, muddy embankment that led down to the water's edge. It was a suicide move. The slope was almost vertical, covered in slick clay and tangled roots. Midnight screamed, his legs splaying out as he began to slide. Bento tucked his head down, clinging to the horse's neck, as they tumbled toward the roaring Ribeirão. "He's going into the water," one of the riders shouted. Faustino ran to the edge of the bridge, peering down into the shadows. He saw a massive splash. He saw the black shape of the horse disappear into the foam. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the river. "He's dead," Gades said, breathing hard. "Nobody survives that fall in this current." Faustino watched the spot where they went down. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. But as he looked up, he saw the judge's carriage stopping at the entrance to the bridge. Judge Mireles stepped out, his tall silk hat gleaming in the fading light. He looked at the colonel, then at the armed men, then at the churning water below. "Colonel Faustino," the judge said, his voice like cold iron. "I heard a gunshot, and I see you are quite busy this evening. Perhaps you can explain why your stableman just rode a horse off a cliff." The colonel opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked back at the river, a sense of impending doom settling over him. He had won, hadn't he? The man was gone. The paper was at the bottom of the Ribeirão. But what Faustino didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that Bento had spent 40 years learning how to survive things that would kill a lesser man. And downstream, hidden by the overhanging willows, a hand was reaching for a sturdy root. The gears had stopped, but the river was still moving, and it was carrying the truth straight to the village square. Bento didn't die in the Ribeirão. He crawled out of the red mud 2 miles downstream, his lungs burning and his left arm hanging limp, but his fingers were still locked around that leather pouch. While Colonel Faustino was busy spinning lies to Judge Mireles back at the bridge, Bento was limping through the shadows toward the flickering lights of Salto Escuro. He was a ghost covered in slime, driven by a single purpose. When Faustino finally arrived at the village square an hour later, he thought he had managed to talk his way out of the gunshot. He was straightening his coat, preparing to invite the judge to a lavish dinner to bury the suspicion. But then he saw the crowd. They were gathered around the steps of the courthouse, silent and expectant. In the center of the circle stood Bento. He was dripping wet, shivering, and holding out the silver casing of the watch. Faustino's composure shattered. He lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. He screamed that the stableman was a thief, a madman who had stolen a family heirloom to spite his master. He reached for his pistol, but the soldiers were faster. They pinned his arms back as Judge Mireles stepped forward. The judge didn't look at the colonel. He looked at the silver in Bento's hand. Bento didn't waste breath on accusations. He simply showed the judge the hidden seam. The click that followed was the sound of Faustino's world collapsing. The judge pulled out the parchment and read the letter aloud. He read about the bitter tea, the forged debts, and the brother who had watched Otavio die with a smile on his face. The local priest, who had witnessed the secret will, stepped forward from the shadows of the church and nodded. It was over. The master of Tres Correntes was dragged into the dirt, the same dirt he had forced his people to crawl in. He lost his land, his name and his freedom in the time it takes for a second hand to sweep across a dial. Bento watched as they led the murderer away in irons, the silver watch finally silent in the judge's hand. Subscribe. Here we pull up what they tried to bury. And comment, do you think everyone at the plantation knew the truth? Or did they just choose to pretend to stay safe? Greed makes a man blind to the small things. Faustino thought he was throwing away a piece of junk, but he was actually handing over the keys to his own prison cell. The gears stopped, Colonel, but the truth kept moving. In the end, justice didn't need a whip. It just needed the steady hands of a man who knew how to fix what was broken.